Before the flood came, there was a Tuesday morning. Someone woke before dawn in a city that had stood for 3 centuries. A woman knelt at her millstone and began to grind. A man checked his irrigation channels before the heat of the day settled over the river valley. A craftsman lit his forge fire and reached for bronze tools that his grandfather had made. A musician in a courtyard tuned strings stretched across a wooden frame, built from knowledge passed down through 7 generations. None of them knew that within a generation, every city, every forge, every courtyard, every millstone would be buried beneath water that came from both the sky and the earth at once. None of them knew that the world they had built over 16 centuries of continuous human civilization would cease to exist. This is the story that almost nobody tells when they tell the story of Noah's flood. Not the ark, not the animals, not the rainbow. The story of the people who were there before it happened, what they ate, where they lived, how they organized their society, what daily life actually looked like in the world that God described with one word: corrupt. The antediluvian world is one of the least examined civilizations in human history, and it may have been one of the most extraordinary. Today we are going to look at it directly, without softening the details, without sanitizing the history, and without pretending that the people who lived and died in it were anything other than fully human beings, living inside a civilization that had made choices with consequences we still can barely comprehend. According to the genealogies of Genesis chapters 4 and 5, the period from Adam to the flood spans approximately 1,656 years. To put that in perspective, that is the same elapsed time as the gap between the fall of Rome in 476 CE and today, an entire sweep of history comparable to the full span of European civilization, from the barbarian migrations to the present moment passed before the waters rose. This was not a brief or transitional culture. It was an ancient, layered, deeply developed civilization with its own cities, its own technologies, its own music, its own traditions of craft and agriculture and law. And the people inside that civilization did not age the way we age. Methuselah lived 969 years. His father Enoch lived 365 years, which by the standards of his time was almost shockingly brief. Jared lived 962 years. Noah himself would live 950 years total, 600 of them before the flood. These are not symbolic round numbers chosen for poetic resonance. The biblical text treats them as actual lifespans, documented with the numerical precision of a genealogical record, with specific ages at the birth of each first-named child and specific ages at death. What does it mean, practically and socially, for human beings to live that long? His son Seth lived 912 years. Adam was still alive for the first 800 years of Seth's life. Seth lived long enough to overlap with Noah's father Lamech by 112 years. The chain of human memory in the pre-flood world was not a chain of distant ancestors and inherited oral tradition. It was a chain of living people who could sit in the same room and speak to each other across what would be, in modern terms, dozens of generations. A craftsman who began learning his trade at age 20 in the antediluvian world could still be practicing that same craft 700 years later. 7 centuries of accumulated skill, refined technique, and hard-won knowledge about materials and process and method. The most experienced metalworker in the pre-flood world had been working iron and bronze for longer than the entire history of ancient Greece, from its earliest settlements to its fall. This is why the civilization that the biblical text describes when you pay careful attention to its details, could not have been primitive, not with that much accumulated time. The first thing Genesis tells us about post-Eden human civilization is that Cain, the son of Adam, built a city. Genesis 4:17 records this with no particular fanfare, as if city building is simply what humans naturally do. Cain built a city and named it after his son Enoch. This is not a metaphor, it is not a symbol, it is a historical statement. The first generation after Eden built a permanent, named urban settlement. Archaeology cannot directly answer this question, since a global flood event of the magnitude described in Genesis would have obliterated most physical evidence of pre-flood civilization, erasing landscapes and depositing enormous layers of sediment over whatever had stood before. But the biblical text itself provides enough information to reconstruct the broad outlines. The descendants of Cain listed in Genesis 4 were not farmers eking out subsistence survival. They were specialists in a diversified economy. Jabal, one of Lamech's sons, is described as the father of those who live in tents and raise livestock. This is organized animal husbandry at scale. The management of large herds, requiring planning, infrastructure, and coordinated labor across wide territorial ranges. His brother Jubal is called the father of all who play stringed instruments and pipes. Music required not just talent, but tools, instruments crafted from wood and metal and gut and hollow bone, instruments that implied a level of cultural sophistication well beyond bare survival. And Tubal-Cain, the third son of Lamech, is described as one who forged all kinds of tools out of bronze and iron. Bronze and iron. That detail stops every careful reader of Genesis in their tracks. Ironworking in the mainstream archaeological timeline does not appear until roughly 1200 BCE, at the transition between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age in the ancient Near East. Yet Genesis places ironworking in the family of Cain, in the earliest generations of human civilization. Whatever chronological model we use to situate the antediluvian period, the text is making a clear and emphatic statement. The world before the flood was technologically advanced. The people who lived before the flood were not primitives scratching in the dirt. They were metallurgists who had mastered the two most important industrial metals in the ancient world. They were musicians creating instruments of complexity and beauty. They were herders managing livestock at industrial scale. They were city builders constructing permanent urban settlements in a river valley landscape. This is the detail that almost nobody mentions when they retell the story of Noah's flood. The world that was destroyed was not a world of cave dwellers. It was a world of artisans and craftsmen, and merchants and musicians and engineers, living in cities that had stood for generations, practicing technologies that the post-flood world would not rediscover for thousands of years. But here is the detail that flips the whole picture. What did these people eat? The answer in the pre-flood world was very different from anything that came after. Genesis 1:29 records God's original dietary provision for all humanity. I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. This was the diet of Eden, and according to the biblical text, it remained the diet of the entire antediluvian civilization. Genesis 9:3. After the flood, when God tells Noah that every moving creature may now serve as food. This means that the pre-flood diet was entirely plant-based. The civilization of Tubal-Cain, the metallurgist, The civilization of Jubal, the musician, the civilization of Jabal, the herdsman, was sustained without meat. The enormous herds of livestock that Jabal managed were not food animals. They provided wool, leather, labor, transportation, and perhaps milk and other secondary products, but not flesh for eating. The protein of the entire antediluvian civilization came from legumes, from nuts, from grains, from seeds, from the extraordinary diversity of plant foods that the river valley environments of ancient Mesopotamia could produce. Every category of plant food, from grain crops to fruit orchards, to vegetable gardens, to legume fields, to oil-producing plants, was essential to feeding a population of cities. This required sophisticated agricultural knowledge accumulated over generations. Different crops planted and harvested at different seasons. Seed selection refined over centuries to improve yield and disease resistance. Irrigation systems maintained with precision to distribute water equitably across the full agricultural landscape. Picture what daily food preparation looked like in this world. The first sounds of the day were the rhythmic grinding of stone on stone. Producing enough flour for a family's daily bread from raw grain required hand grinding at a saddle quern. The upper stone pushed forward and pulled back against the lower surface with body weight. Studies of skeletal remains from early agricultural populations show characteristic stress markers in the knees, lower back, and shoulders of individuals who spent years doing this work. The grinding alone could take 1 to 2 hours before any baking could begin. The bread that emerged from this flour was dense, nutritious, and filling. Flatbreads unleavened and baked on hot stones or clay griddles placed over fire. More substantial loaves baked in clay dome ovens that retained heat with remarkable efficiency. The ancient wood-fired clay oven, a design that survived essentially unchanged from the earliest human settlements through to the medieval period, could hold temperatures sufficient for a complete bake cycle after a relatively brief heating period. The smell of bread baking in the pre-dawn darkness of an antediluvian city would have been the smell of daily life itself. Beyond bread, the antediluvian diet would have included legumes cooked into thick soups and stews, the primary protein source for a plant-based civilization. Lentils and chickpeas and fava beans, crops that had been cultivated in the ancient Near East since the earliest settlements, were the foundation of the evening meal. Fresh and dried fruits available according to the season, dates and figs and pomegranates, preserved by sun-drying for year-round use, vegetables grown in household gardens, olive oil pressed from fruit, sesame oil from seeds, used for cooking, for preserving food, and for lamps that provided light after dark. Now step away from the kitchen and into the streets. Walk out of a household courtyard through its narrow door onto the main street of an antediluvian city, and what strikes you immediately is the scale of ordinary human activity. The city is not silent. It is never silent. The metal ring of the smith's forge from the craftsman's quarter, the voices of merchants in the market space near the city gate, negotiating over grain and tools and textiles, the sound of a water channel running along the street edge, carrying irrigation water from the main canal to the garden plots within the city walls, the smell of damp clay and wood smoke and cooking food and animal dung from the livestock pens on the city's edge. Ancient cities in the Mesopotamian river valley were built around water. Every one of them was. River access provided irrigation for the surrounding agricultural land, water for drinking and cooking and washing, and a transportation route for the movement of goods and people. Random accumulations of housing. With canal systems that distributed water from the main river channels into every field and garden in the urban agricultural zone. Maintaining these irrigation systems was one of the primary collective obligations of city life. A main irrigation canal from the river could require weeks of coordinated labor to clear of silt deposits each year. Secondary distribution channels needed regular maintenance. The berm systems that controlled water flow had to be monitored and repaired. No single family could maintain the infrastructure that kept an entire city's agricultural system functioning. This required collective organization, shared labor obligations, and some form of authority to enforce both. Shadows. Organization requires authority. Authority in the ancient world required enforcement. Enforcement. In a world without the formal state apparatus of law courts and police forces, meant physical power. The men who organized the irrigation work, who managed the market transactions, who settled the disputes between neighbors over water rights and property boundaries, were men with resources and followers and the willingness to use both. Not all houses were the same. The homes of ordinary farmers and craftsmen were modest structures of mud brick, centered on a small courtyard with a grinding stone and clay oven and storage jars. The homes of the powerful were something different. Larger courtyards, more rooms, better construction, storage areas of sufficient size to hold the surplus grain and trade goods that represented accumulated wealth. The elite of the antediluvian world lived differently from the workers who sustained their power. The walls of these houses, whether modest or grand, were built from the same fundamental material, mud brick. Sun-dried mud brick, formed in wooden molds and dried in the abundant sunlight of the Mesopotamian climate, was cheap and available to every builder in the region. Kiln-fired brick, which was harder and more durable but required significant fuel investment, was reserved for the most important structures. Walls were typically 2 to 3 feet thick to provide insulation from the extreme temperatures of the summer and winter seasons. Roofs were flat, constructed of wooden beams laid across the wall tops and covered with reed matting, packed earth, and a mud plaster surface. The roof was not wasted space. In a climate where summer temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, sleeping indoors was nearly impossible during the hottest months. Families moved to their rooftops for evening meals and sleeping. The roof was where the day ended, where the family gathered as the temperature dropped with the setting sun, where women wove and mended while men repaired tools, where children played under the watch of grandparents who had been alive for 400 years. That last detail is worth dwelling on. In the pre-flood world, grandparents were not figures of the distant past. They were present, active, and potentially 500 years older than the grandchildren they watched on the rooftop at evening. The social weight of this reality cannot be overstated. A family in the antediluvian world might have living ancestors spanning 20 or 30 generations. The oldest member of a family line was not a frail elder propped up in a corner. They were a person who had been accumulating skill, knowledge, wealth, relationships, and authority for centuries. This meant that in the antediluvian world, wisdom and power were concentrated in ways that have no modern equivalent. The oldest living patriarch in a community was not merely respected, he was a force of nature. He had outlived empires of personal knowledge. He had watched fashions in every domain of human activity cycle through multiple complete revolutions while he was still working the same craft. He had seen the children of his children become old people while he was still young enough to lead a harvest crew. The social hierarchy that emerged from this reality was both natural and rigid. Authority flowed from age and accumulated power. The young deferred to the old deferred to the ancient, and the ancient, in a world where the most ancient were approaching 1,000 years of life, were an entirely different category of being from anything in the post-flood world. Now watch what happens when you add the religious dimension of this world. Genesis 4:26 records a detail that is easy to overlook. At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. This is connected in the text to the birth of Enosh, Seth's son. The phrase suggests that formalized religious practice, structured communal worship, organized calling on the divine, began in this generation. The antediluvian world was not a world without religion. It was a world in which religious practice was institutionalized from an early stage. What that religious practice looked like in its original form is not detailed in the Genesis text, but it clearly existed, and it clearly had a positive character in its earliest expression. That positive character has been catastrophically corrupted. Genesis 6:1-4 opens with one of the most debated passages in the entire Hebrew Bible. The sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. From these unions came the Nephilim, described in verse 4 as the heroes of old, men of renown. And the ancient world's interpretive traditions varied widely in how they understood who these beings were and where they came from. The most ancient Jewish interpretation, preserved in texts like the Book of Enoch and reflected in much of Second Temple Judaism, understood the sons of God as supernatural beings, members of the divine council who abandoned their proper place and entered into sexual union with human women. The New Testament references in 2 Peter 2:4 and Jude 6 to angels who did not keep their own domain appear to support this reading. The other major interpretation, that the sons of God refers to the descendants of Seth intermarrying with the descendants of Cain, has a long tradition in Christian interpretation, but requires treating a term that elsewhere in the Old Testament consistently refers to divine or supernatural beings as though it means something quite different here. Something about the world of Genesis 6 involved a catastrophic violation of the boundaries between the human and the supernatural, and the result was a class of beings who combined extraordinary power with extraordinary danger. The Nephilim are described as heroes and mighty men, and men of renown, which in the language of the ancient world is the description of a warrior aristocracy. And this is the point where the daily life of ordinary people in the antediluvian world intersects with the reason the flood happened. A world with a warrior aristocracy of exceptional power, backed by whatever supernatural authority the Nephilim possessed or were perceived to possess, was a world in which ordinary farmers and craftsmen and women and merchants lived in the shadow of that power. The daily life of these ordinary people, the grinding and the baking and the farming and the metalwork, all of it was conducted within a social structure dominated by men of renown who had no accountability to anything outside their own power. 11 uses a specific Hebrew word to describe what this produced: Hamas. The word is usually translated simply as violence, but Hamas, in the Hebrew legal tradition, carries a much more specific and devastating meaning. It refers to systemic wrongdoing, to the corrupt and coercive exercise of power against the defenseless. When the prophets condemn the exploitation of the poor, when the Psalms cry out against unjust rulers, when the law codes describe what is forbidden in a just society, the word Hamas appears again and again to describe organized, structural injustice built into the fabric of a civilization. This was not a description of random chaos or occasional outbursts of cruelty. This was a description of a civilization that had organized itself around exploitation. The earth was full of it, not some corners, not some periods. The entire earth, according to Genesis 6:12, because all flesh had corrupted its way. And here is the detail that most retellings of the flood narrative leave out entirely. The musicians were inside this system. The metallurgists were inside this system. The farmers and the merchants and the city builders were inside this system. The ordinary woman grinding grain before dawn was inside this system. Ordinary life in the antediluvian world was not separate from the corruption the text describes. It was the context in which the corruption existed and from which it drew its sustenance. The daily labor of ordinary people fed and clothed and supplied the men of renown. The markets of the antediluvian cities moved goods produced by workers who had no power over the terms of their participation. The irrigation systems that fed the agricultural landscape were maintained by collective labor, organized and directed by those with the power to compel it. Not that every individual was a monster engaged in constant acts of cruelty, but that the civilization as a whole, in its structures and systems and daily operations, had organized itself around the corrupt use of power in ways that were by the time of Genesis 6 so total and so embedded that there was no longer any meaningful alternative operating within it, except Noah. Genesis 6:9 describes Noah in three ways. He was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked with God. The phrase blameless among the people of his time is crucial. It is blameless relative to the world he actually lived in. Noah's righteousness was not achieved in isolation from the corruption surrounding him. It was maintained inside it, in the same markets, breathing the same air, watching the Nephilim pass through the same streets. And then God spoke to Noah. We do not know exactly how God communicated with Noah. The text records the content of what was said, not the mechanism of the saying. What God said was this: "For the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth. So make yourself an ark of gopher wood." The dimensions that followed were precise: 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high, 3 decks, a single door set in the side. a window near the top running around the vessel, an interior of rooms, coating inside and out with pitch. Using the ancient Egyptian royal cubit of approximately 20.6 inches, the ark was roughly 515 feet long, 86 feet wide, and 52 feet tall. Its gross volume was approximately 1.5 million cubic feet. By comparison, the RMS Titanic was 882 feet long. The ark was roughly 58% the length of the Titanic, but its blunt-hulled box shape gave it an enormous carrying capacity relative to its length. It had 3 internal decks, each providing approximately 44,000 square feet of floor space, for a total interior area of roughly 132,000 square feet. This was not a boat in any nautical sense. It had no keel, no rudder, no means of propulsion or navigation. It was a sealed floating container designed for one specific purpose: to survive a catastrophic global flood while keeping its occupants alive. The ancient Babylonian flood narrative, the Atrahasis epic, describes a flood vessel built in a circular shape. The Genesis account describes a rectangular box optimized for stability rather than speed, which is exactly what you would design if your goal was to stay afloat in turbulent water without capsizing, rather than to travel anywhere. Building this structure took time measured not in months but in decades. The traditions surrounding Noah, reflected in 2 Peter 2:5, where he is called a preacher of righteousness, suggest that Noah's construction project extended over a period of 120 years. Whether or not that specific figure is taken as precise, the scale of the ark's dimensions makes clear that building it was a multi-generational undertaking of immense difficulty. Large timbers of gopher wood, an unidentified species whose name may refer to a specific tree or a specific construction method, had to be felled in forests, transported to the construction site, shaped and fitted with the precision required to create a waterproof vessel, and sealed throughout with bituminous pitch. The pitch itself deserves attention. Bitumen, the natural tar-like hydrocarbon substance that seeps from the ground in many parts of the ancient Near East, particularly in the Mesopotamian river valley, was a known construction and waterproofing material in the ancient world. Archaeological evidence shows bitumen being used for waterproofing in ancient Mesopotamia from very early periods. Noah was not working with an unfamiliar material when he applied pitch to the ark. He was using the best available waterproofing technology of his world, applied at extraordinary scale. For the entire construction period, whatever its precise duration, the activity was visible. An ark 515 feet long cannot be built secretly. The workers, whether family members or possibly hired labor in the early stages, would have been a daily presence in the landscape. The growing structure would have been a constant and increasingly conspicuous feature of the local environment. People would have seen it. People would have asked questions. And whatever Noah told them, it clearly did not produce the response that belief in coming judgment would logically have produced. They kept eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage. Genesis 7 records the final movements before the flood with the quiet precision of a legal document. God told Noah to come into the ark, he and all his household, because Noah alone God had found righteous in this generation. 7 days of final loading, 7 pairs of every clean animal, and 1 pair of every unclean animal, taken aboard according to their kinds. And on the 17th day of the 2nd month of Noah's 600th year, the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened. Water came from below and from above simultaneously. The fountains of the deep suggest geological upheaval, the release of water stored under enormous pressure in the Earth's own hydrology, in addition to precipitation from above. This was not a regional flood caused by extended rainfall. The text is describing a total reversal of the physical order that had held since the third day of creation, when God had gathered the waters below the sky into one place and let dry land appear. The flood undid that. The boundaries collapsed, the waters returned. The rain fell for 40 days and 40 nights without stopping. For 40 days, water levels rose. The rivers overflowed their banks and then ceased to have banks. The lowlands flooded first, then the hills, then the mountains. The text records that the water rose to cover the highest mountains by a depth of more than 15 cubits, roughly 22 feet. The ark floated above it all. What was happening outside the ark during those 40 days is not described. The text has no interest in the experience of drowning. What it records is the experience of preservation, the systematic accounting of what was saved and what the purpose of saving it was. But the human imagination, confronted with the scale of what the text describes, cannot help but supply what the text omits. The farmer who did not believe Noah was swept from his field. The merchant whose trade route was still active the week before was overtaken by rising water somewhere on the road. The musician who had been practicing in the city courtyard 3 months ago was gone. The metal worker, the herdsman, the city administrator, the ordinary woman grinding grain before dawn. All of them overtaken, in different places, at different moments, but all of them overtaken. Genesis 7:21-23 records what happened with stark economy. Every living thing that moved on land perished: birds, livestock, wild animals, all the creatures that swarm over the earth, and all mankind. Everything on dry land that had the breath of life in its nostrils died. Every living thing on the face of the earth was wiped out. Only Noah was left, and those with him in the ark. The waters prevailed over the earth for 150 days, 5 months of global inundation, 5 months of the ark floating on a surface of water with no land visible in any direction. Inside the ark, 8 people managed the impossible logistics of caring for an enormous collection of animals in a sealed wooden vessel. The ventilation came from a single opening near the top. The light during the day was whatever filtered through that opening and its coverings. The movement of the vessel on the surface of a world covered in water was continuous, the slow rolling and pitching of a blunt-hulled box without stabilizing ballast. What kept Noah's family sane during those 5 months is not recorded. What is recorded is what God was doing. God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark, and God sent a wind over the earth, and the waters receded. To remember is to act on behalf of the one remembered, to turn attention and care actively toward a person or situation. God remembered Noah meant that God was now actively working to bring the flood to its end and to restore what had been preserved. The springs of the deep closed, the rain stopped, the water began to go down. The ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat on the 17th day of the 7th month. 2.5 months later, on the first day of the 10th month, the tops of the surrounding mountains became visible above the receding water. Noah opened the window. He sent out a raven, which flew back and forth over the water, never alighting, because there was no dry land surface for it to rest on. He sent out a dove. The dove found no resting place and returned. Noah waited 7 days and sent the dove again. This time it returned with a freshly plucked olive leaf in its beak. Olive trees were above the water surface. The vegetation was re-emerging. He waited another 7 days and sent the dove a third time. It did not return. On the first day of the first month of Noah's 601st year, the water had dried from the earth. Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked out over the landscape for the first time in over a year. And on the 27th day of the 2nd month, God spoke, "Come out of the ark, you and your wife, and your sons and their wives." Bring out every kind of living creature that is with you, the birds, the animals, and all the creatures that move along the ground, so they can multiply on the earth and be fruitful and increase in number on it. What he saw was a world fundamentally different from the world he had known for 6 centuries. Not merely a wet version of the old landscape, restored to its pre-flood condition once the water drained away. Something had changed at the level of the earth itself. The evidence for this is in the single most measurable fact in the post-flood narrative. The genealogy of Shem, Noah's son, recorded in Genesis 11, tells the story in numbers that are impossible to argue with. Shem himself lived 600 years, close to the pre-flood norm. And then the decline accelerated sharply. Peleg, the next generation, lived only 239 years. Recu lived 239 years. Serug lived 230 years. Nahor lived 148 years. Terah lived 205 years. Abraham, the great patriarch of the Israelite nation, lived 175 years. From 969 years to 175 years in 9 generations. That is not a gradual statistical drift. That is a structural change in the physical conditions that support human life. Something about the post-flood world was different from the pre-flood world in ways that affected human biology at the most fundamental level. The mechanisms proposed by scholars include changes in atmospheric composition, the elimination of a protective water vapor layer in the upper atmosphere, shifts in solar radiation reaching the surface, changes in the nutritional content of post-flood plant life, or simply the cumulative genetic effects of passing through a population bottleneck of 8 individuals. The biblical text does not specify the mechanism. It simply records the result. The lifespans declined, and with them, everything that had made the pre-flood world structurally distinctive began to disappear. The social authority of 900-year-old patriarchs was gone. The accumulated skill of 700-year-old craftsmen was gone. The living memory that connected the present to the origins of civilization was gone. The world after the flood had to rebuild everything from scratch, and it had to do so with a human population that would live only a fraction of the time its predecessors had lived. The first thing God did after Noah emerged from the ark was establish a covenant, not a conditional agreement that required human compliance to stay in force, an unconditional commitment, sealed with a visible sign, that God would never again destroy the earth with a global flood. The rainbow in the clouds was the sign of this covenant, and it was made not merely with Noah and his descendants, but with every living creature on earth, with all future generations, for all time. The covenant also established 2 new provisions that dramatically changed the daily life of the post-flood world. The first was the permission to eat meat. Genesis 9:3 records it plainly. Every moving creature that lives shall be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything. The post-flood world would be a world in which animal protein was part of the human food supply. This was not merely a dietary preference. It was a practical necessity in a world where the agricultural landscape had been devastated by a year of global inundation and would require years to restore to full productivity. The second provision was a moral framework for human society that had no equivalent in the pre-flood world. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed, for in the image of God has God made mankind. This principle, establishing the sanctity of human life and the accountability of those who take it, was placed at the foundation of the new post-flood social order. It was, in effect, a direct response to the Hamas that had characterized the civilization that had been destroyed. The new world would operate on a different principle. And then Noah planted a vineyard. That single detail in Genesis 9:20 is one of the most quietly significant moments in the post-flood narrative. Planting a vineyard is not a desperate survival measure. It is an act of deliberate long-term planning, of hope, of civilization building. Grapevines take years to mature and produce. You plant them only if you believe you will still be there when they bear fruit, and you plant them knowing that the harvest you tend belongs not just to you, but to those who come after you. Noah. Stepping out onto a radically altered world at the age of 601, planted for the future. He also, in due time, drank from that vineyard and became drunk, which Genesis 9:21 records with the same matter-of-fact directness that characterizes the entire Genesis narrative. Human history eventually lay uncovered in his tent after too much wine. The antediluvian patriarch, the only righteous man in the most corrupt civilization ever to exist, was also a human being who sometimes drank too much. And the consequences of that evening, the episode with Ham and the cursing of Canaan in Genesis 9:20-27, set in motion social and political dynamics that would echo through centuries of biblical history. The tent of the righteous man became a location of family shame and divided blessing. The same human frailty that had filled the pre-flood world with Hamas was present in the household of the man who had survived the flood that destroyed that world. The sons of Noah spread across the earth. Their genealogies, recorded in Genesis 10, became the nations. Shem's descendants settled the ancient Near East and became the Semitic peoples. Ham's descendants populated Africa and the coastal regions of the Mediterranean. Japheth's descendants spread across Anatolia and into Europe. The world of post-flood humanity was not a single civilization building on the foundations of the old one. It was a diversification of cultures and languages and people groups that filled the earth with a human variety the antediluvian world had apparently not possessed. Civilization of the antediluvian world. So that we may make a name for ourselves, the builders said. The phrase make a name for ourselves echoes the Nephilim, who were men of renown, literally men of name. The ambition was not merely architectural, it was the ambition to recreate the kind of concentrated human power that had characterized the pre-flood world. God's response was to scatter them. The multiplication of cultures and languages and political structures across the breadth of the earth was not a punishment in the simple sense. It was a prevention. A world concentrated in one place, with one language and one power structure, had already demonstrated what it would do with that concentration. The scatter of Babel made that particular kind of total corruption permanently more difficult to achieve. Jesus, speaking to his disciples on the Mount of Olives in what we call the Olivet Discourse, referenced the days of Noah with deliberate specificity. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark, and they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. These are not descriptions of extraordinary wickedness. They are descriptions of the most basic activities of daily human life. The flood narrative does not end with a list of specific atrocities committed by the people who drowned. It ends with a description of ordinary life continuing right up to the moment of catastrophe. The point Jesus was making was not that eating and drinking and marrying were wrong. The point was that the ordinariness of daily life had become the framework within which the complete moral collapse of a civilization was operating. The corruption was not exceptional, it was structural, and the people inside it were not primarily people who experienced their daily lives as the context for their corruption. They experienced their daily lives as their daily lives, which happened to be embedded in a civilization where Hamas was the organizing principle. This is what makes the flood narrative so demanding when you sit with it honestly. The woman grinding grain before dawn was not grinding grain as an act of corruption. The merchant in the market was not transacting as an act of corruption. The musician playing his instrument in the courtyard was not playing music as an act of corruption. They were living their lives, but the civilization in which they were living those lives had, over 1,600 years, chosen to build itself on foundations of systemic injustice, supernatural violation, coercive power, and the complete disregard for everything God had intended when He made the world. And the question the flood narrative puts to every subsequent generation is not primarily a question about geology or archaeology or the precise physical extent of a flood event. Those are real and important questions that deserve serious scholarly attention. But the question the narrative itself is asking is more personal and more pressing. What does it mean to live ordinary daily life inside a civilization that has made choices you did not individually make, but whose consequences you are embedded in? Noah's answer was not to withdraw. He was not a hermit. He was not separated from the antediluvian world by any physical or social barrier. He moved through the same markets. He breathed the same air. He watched the men of renown walk through his city, and he chose, daily, across 600 years of that world, to walk with God in the middle of it. And then he built something that demonstrated what he believed. For the duration of the construction period, whether measured in decades or a full 120 years, Noah's daily life included the work of the ark. The assessment of the day's work to be done, the felling and shaping and fitting of timber, the application of pitch, the assembly of internal structures, all of it carried out in full view of the civilization that surrounded him and under constant daily pressure from the same social environment that had filled the earth with Hamas. He finished it, he boarded it, the door was sealed from the outside, Genesis 7. 16 records, not by Noah, but by God. And the rains came. The world that existed for 1,656 years, the cities and forges, and music, and markets, and families and violence, and culture, and exploitation, and skill, and beauty, and corruption, all of it went beneath the surface of a global ocean and stayed there for 150 days. 8 people floated above it. And when the water receded and the 8 survivors stepped out onto the remade earth, they carried with them not only the genetic heritage of humanity and the animal kingdom, but also the memory of what the old world had been. Noah had lived in it for 600 years. He knew its music and its markets and its metalwork and its violence. He knew what a civilization looked like when it chose, over the course of 16 centuries, to build itself on foundations that could not bear the weight. And he knew what it looked like when God decided that enough was enough. The rainbow in the clouds is still there when it rains. The covenant it seals is still in force. The world we live in is the world that emerged from the waters of the flood, reshaped and remade and populated by the descendants of 8 survivors. The diversity of human cultures and languages and civilizations that covers the earth today traces its origins to those 3 sons of Noah and their wives, dispersed from Ararat into a world that was both entirely new and entirely human. The bread grinders are still here. The metal workers are still here. The musicians and the merchants and the farmers and the city builders are still here. We are still eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage. We are still building our cities and organizing our economies and creating our cultures. And the flood narrative asks us, as it has asked every generation since it was written down, what it is that we are building them on.